I am Reverend Kim Kendrick. I proudly serve as one of the co-pastors here alongside our co-pastor, Reverend Vladimir Payeste. Welcome to Community Congregational Church, where we live into and we believe that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. It is my joy and honor to introduce our guest lecturer this afternoon. She is not only a prophetic voice in our denomination, but she is part of the spiritual DNA here at Community Congregational Church. Dr. Gast has been a poet, a pastor, currently a poet and a pastor, a teacher, an activist, an author, and someone that has shaped not only the Northern California Nevada Conference, but even folks like me personally that need the mentoring, that appreciate the mentoring and the inspiration. Dr. Gast is here to help us to take a look at what is and what does it mean and how we can respond to white Christian nationalism. I think it's very appropriate as we are here in our church continuing or finishing really our Changemaker series that we have such a changemaker as this in the Reverend Dr. Mary Susan Gast. And since we believe in celebrating here at Community Congregational Church, we celebrate God's gifts in real time, I think it's also appropriate to celebrate that tomorrow is her birthday. Please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Mary Susan Gast.
It is so wonderful to see all of you. We were, as you do before an event or a party or whatever, you kind of stand around and say, okay, will anybody show up? And we were very aware that in our community today, there is an arts benefit going on. There's the opening concert of the Vallejo Symphony going on. There are so many things in people's lives going on that we just didn't know, and look at you all. What a wonderful group. Thank you. We are also recording this presentation, which is why I'm not going to move around a whole lot, so that people who are not able to be here and want to hear it will be able to. So, to begin, a week or so ago, there was the No Kings rally here in our park. And for that event, I decided, especially in light of our awareness of Christian nationalism, to kind of go basic bishop, which I did. Bright magenta clergy shirt, reverse white collar, my shoulders draped with this highly liturgical cloth of gold stole appliqued with 3 gold fleur-de-lis crosses, and carrying a small sign. It says, "Love your enemies, Jesus." There was really no mistaking of my declaration of identity. And many people approached me, one of whom, a 50-ish white man dressed in a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, asked if I was Episcopal. And I said, no, United Church of Christ. And he said, I'm a Catholic priest. And I smiled as an ordained woman at our many denominational differences. And I said, 2 whole different ball games. And then after we looked around briefly at the crowd around us, we turned to each other again, our eyes met, and we said, maybe not. Acknowledging that we were there, unseparated by our differences in church traditions or tenets, because of our basic orientation to Christianity. An orientation and understanding which I recently saw concisely stated by Willie Nelson. The Bible says in 1 John 4, God is love, period. End of story. The God is love thing, the rubric from the prophet Micah, what does the Most High require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with our God? The building of the beloved community, where all shall dwell secure in dignity, well-being, and harmony. Those are all mythic visions. Now, sometimes we use that word myth to mean something that's untrue. But, not to go all woo-woo here, but myths are stories, symbolic tales that direct our actions, that lie at our understanding of life. Many people of faith, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, and people of no religious or spiritual affiliation, share in that mythic motivation toward compassion and reconciliation, liberty and justice for all. There's a new book that's out, and I think the author has been interviewed on a number of shows. It's one of the books up here on display. Has a brilliant title, Separation of Church and Hate. The author, John Fugelsang, has said that some of my atheist friends like to say that religion is responsible for all the world's hate, violence, sexism, homophobia, war, and oppression. And I can certainly understand how they feel that way. But they're mistaken. The primary driver of most global conflict, oppression of women, suppression of science, persecution of gay people, and abuse of power is not religion. It is, he says, the extreme fundamentalist wings of all the world's religions that provide all these dramas for the rest of humanity. I would add two things to that observation. First, religious groups who are seeking political dominance usually adhere to fundamentals that are conspicuously lacking in compassion or empathy. And second, that those religious fundamentals give way to repressive and punitive actions when fused with political power. Christian nationalism is that kind of fusion. Now, within the past year, a couple of books have been published on themes of toxic empathy and the sin of empathy, addressing the ways in which progressives promote empathy to manipulate people into accepting all manner of things regarded by the book's authors as sin. Access to abortion, LGBTQ rights, harboring immigrants. As Pastor Josh McPherson put it, empathy is dangerous. Empathy is toxic. Empathy will align you with hell. A post on the website of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., recalls that when Bishop Marianne Budde preached at the Interfaith Service of Prayer for the Nation in January, she beseeched President Trump to have mercy on the most vulnerable among us. Her words, the post says, triggered an avalanche of Christian nationalist condemnation. Much of it highlighted what her critics literally called the sin of empathy. Their argument was that empathy amounts to a false gospel of kindness that enables a culture of coddling and weakness. The Speaker of the House commented, Bishop Buddy hijacked the National Prayer Service to promote her radical ideology. Shameful. A group of legislators presented a resolution expressing the sense of the House of Representatives that the sermon given by the Right Reverend Marianne Edgar Buddy was a display of political activism and condemning its distorted message. I've always been of the persuasion that Jesus was big on empathy, welcoming sinners, eating with them, risking personal contamination by healing people with repugnant diseases, telling stories of how someone in an ethnic group that was despised by the people hearing the stories had empathy for a person who had been robbed, beaten, and left for dead, and in doing so, that person surpassed in godliness the two religious leaders who had passed by and ignored the situation. But I can see how empathy would have been dangerous, supremely disadvantageous to carrying out the Crusades, the Inquisition, the doctrine of discovery, the Salem witch trials, the slave trade, pogroms, the Holocaust. All of that depended upon the dehumanization by the religious establishment of those who were to be chastened, exploited, or exterminated by the government. No room for empathy. Some of us are old enough to remember how after World War II, questions abounded. How did so many seemingly good people who loved their families, who were church members, take part in the atrocities of death camps and genocide? I was only following orders was the frequent response from those on trial for war crimes. And there was much sociological and psychological assessment of how people could follow those orders that went against any sense of compassion, that seemingly betrayed any teaching from the Gospels. The general conclusion was that Germany was in such a demoralized state after their loss in World War I. People were starving. The Kaiser, and Kaiser is a Germanized rendering of Caesar or Tsar, emperor. The Kaiser had fled. The Kaiser had been a swaggering militarist whose incompetence as a head of state left the structures of government in chaos. The task of planting a fragile new democracy in the soil of that shambles was overwhelming for the state of Germany. The whole process had come suddenly and uninvited as a product of military defeat and the pressure of Germany's enemies, so that when the National Socialists, the Nazis, came onto the scene, they were able to summon a following who yearned for order and for the reemergence of a national identity. And in that climate, observers concluded, people followed orders. When Hitler dehumanized and identified as enemies the communist vermin, the Jews and migrants poisoning Aryan blood, a disheartened Christian German people was soothed by the theory that they were part of a superior race, They were the Aryan nation, entitled to rule the rest of humanity, to sanctify and to impose their social order, to be great again. The voice of Hitler sounded to them a lot like the voice of the Good Shepherd, who recognizes them and protects them from harm. They followed him. Not all, of course, followed him. Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, picked up on the discordant tones in Hitler's voice. He wrote in a letter to his grandmother. I always like to hear about offspring writing letters to their grandmothers. He wrote in a letter to his grandmother in 1933, "It has become ever more evident to me that we are about to be given a great, powerful, national church whose nature cannot be reconciled with Christianity. And we must prepare our minds for the entirely new paths which we will then have to follow. The question is really Christianity or Germanism, Christianity or nationalism. And the sooner that conflict is revealed in the clear light of day, the better." He later put it more tersely. "Only the one who cries out for the Jews may sing Gregorian chants." Christian nationalism is not new. Amanda Tyler describes Christian nationalism in America as a political ideology and cultural framework that seeks to fuse American and Christian identities, but merely uses the veneer of Christianity to advance its own aims. It points not to Jesus of Nazareth, but to the nation as the object of allegiance. Christian nationalism promotes the belief that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and it seeks to enlist government to enforce laws that privilege a particular version of Christianity. The speech that Senator Eric Schmidt delivered this September at the National Conservatism Conference was very clear in its declaration that America is a white Christian nation. He said, "We Americans are the sons and daughters of the Christian pilgrims that poured out from Europe's shores to baptize a new world in their ancient faith. Our ancestors were driven here by destiny, possessed by urgent and fiery conviction, by burning belief. Devoted to their cause and their God, they repelled wave after wave of Indian warband attacks to build this country. It belongs to us. It's our birthright, our heritage, our destiny. When they tear down our statues and monuments, mock our history, and insult our traditions, they're attacking our future as well as our past. By changing the stories that we tell about ourselves, they believe they can build a new America. With the myths," he's on to myths too, "with the myths of a new people. But America does not belong to them, it belongs to us. It's our home. It's a heritage entrusted to us by our ancestors." Are we, constitutionally and theologically speaking, a Christian nation? Were we founded as a Christian nation? There's really no evidence of that in the Constitution. The words Christian, Christianity do not appear. And we're probably all aware that the First Amendment prohibits the government from creating a state-sponsored religion or favoring one religion over another, and guarantees the rights of individuals to practice their own religious beliefs and rituals without government interference. And then there's Article 6 of the Constitution. The Constitution is arranged with the preamble first, and then there's articles before the amendments. And those first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. Article 6 declares in its second and third clauses that the senators and representatives and the members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath of affirmation to support this Constitution. But no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And this was kind of a big deal. When the Constitution was written and signed, most of the state constitutions or colonial charters contained some form of a religious test for holding political office, public office. These ranged from affirming a belief in Christianity in Maryland to affirming the doctrine of the Trinity in Delaware, to disallowing anyone other than Protestants from holding public office in many of the states. In 1787, many believed that a civil government could and should enforce morality by requiring church attendance, personal statements of doctrinal beliefs, and financial support for churches. Thus, the No Religious Test Clause was a radical departure from accepted norms. Amanda Tyler reports, when Article 6 was ratified, those who wanted a Christian nation lost the debate. Oh, and that first clause of Article 6 is the foundation for the federal government's authority over the states. It declares that the U.S. Constitution, federal laws made in accordance with it, and all treaties are the supreme law of the land, and that state judges must follow it, even if state laws conflict with it. Tyler contends that in addition to rewriting American history according to myth, there's that word again, according to myth rather than fact, Christian nationalism is an expression of white supremacy. It overlaps and provides cover for racial subjugation by creating and perpetrating a sense of cultural belonging in the United States only for certain people, those granted full citizenship at the founding of the nation, namely native-born, white Protestant Christian men. As expressed as part of his vision for America by Senator Eric Schmidt, it belongs to us. It's our home. It's a heritage entrusted to us by our ancestors. As remarked upon by U.S. Congresswoman Barbara Jordan in 1974, in her speech at the Watergate hearings, and for those of you who are too young to remember Barbara Jordan, she was the first African-American woman to represent the state of Texas in Congress. At that Watergate hearing, she said, "Earlier today, we heard the beginning of the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. We the people. It's a very eloquent beginning. But when that document was completed on the 17th of September in 1787, I was not included in that, she said. Not in that we the people. The question for us going forward is whether those of us who are not native-born white Protestant men will continue to be embraced as part of we the people. No new myths of a new people, Senator Schmidt warned the National Conservatism Conference. We want no changing of the stories we tell about ourselves. So what is the MAGA story about America? What is the Maga myth? And we all probably have heard articulations of it. I think I first encountered it 20 years ago in the writings of James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family and the Family Research Council, and a strong proponent for the Bible, his interpretation of it, shaping public policy. A child psychologist by training, he wrote and spoke engagingly during his long lifetime. In his book, Straight Talk for Men, he bemoaned the murkiness that obscures sex roles today. He lamented with regard to husbands, alas, is there anything that distinguishes his role from his wife's? And where can he go to find out what is expected of him? Historically, married men were not so uncertain. They understood intuitively that two family responsibilities exceeded all others in significance. They were expected to protect and provide for their wives and children. You can be sure they felt strongly about that obligation. If you insulted a woman in the 19th century or before, you would have dealt shortly with her angry husband. He would not have hesitated to lay down his life for her if necessary. He was the defender of her honor, and she felt secure in his care. He took great satisfaction in what he contributed, materially and otherwise, to the welfare of his family. My reaction when I read that 20 years ago was, huh? Really? This was the case for everybody in the 19th century and before? Just confining my limited brain power to the 1800s, where did I get the impression that there were men who beat their wives or couldn't hold a job or who were so lost in a haze of alcohol that the responsibility to protect and provide for their wives and children seldom bobbled into consciousness? Didn't I read somewhere once about men in the 19th century who were sold away from their children, who, like the mothers of their children, whom they were not necessarily permitted to marry, were enslaved and dwelt secure in no one's care save the Almighty's? Dobson was framing, articulating a myth for those who want to believe in it and are capable of believing in it, warping history, but framing a dream, a gilded memory, a story told about ourselves, arguably of an era that never was, when universally motherhood was honored and women and children were cherished and protected, men laid down their lives for their families, criminals did hard time, and contracts were sealed with a handshake. It's the same dreamscape offered by the late Charlie Kirk, telling young people to get married in their teens. Don't bother with college, have children, and glory in family life. It's the same idealization of a particular kind of family, espoused in and promulgated by Project 2025. A distinguished local poet, Deborah Backles-Schmidt, recently expressed a different take on the Make America Great Again myth. Make America great again? Oh, I get it. You mean back when the rich white men had all the votes, the ones who just got off the boats, saw the bounty on every hand and staked their claims on stolen land, the one whose franchise was the bride of theft, betrayal, and genocide. Or maybe you miss the good old days when fortunes rose on the backs of slaves, torn from their families and their homes, scarred by the lash, and worked to the bone. Ah, you must yearn for the Gilded Age, when children died for a penny wage, in factories that fouled the streams, all for the magnates' golden dreams. You wish that you could go back in time to the days when women towed the line, ironed your shirts and baked your bread, and suffered your will when you came to bed. So which of these charming days of yore are you so determined to restore, when you declare your burning yen to make America great again? In August of this year, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth released a video on social media. It featured two pastors of Hegseth's Fellowship of Faith asserting that women should not have the right to vote. Pastor Doug Wilson later affirmed to the Associated Press that he believes the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote was a bad idea. Understandably, this produced strong reactions among those who are committed to women's voice and vote in electoral politics. And I nod here to a number of the members of the League of Women Voters and the AAUW and the ED of, the Work for Parity in the legislature, all here. Doug Wilson's and Pete Hegseth's church and wider denomination practice complementarianism, the idea that women and men have different God-given roles, and that somehow they know what those are. Women within the community of Reformed evangelical churches cannot hold church leadership positions. Married women are to submit to their husbands, and the pastor would prefer the United States follow his church's example, which allows only heads of households to vote in church elections. He says, ordinarily, the vote is cast by the head of the household, the husband and father, because we're patriarchal and not egalitarian. Vice President J.D. Vance is a practicing Catholic who is self-reportedly heartbroken over the Council of Catholic Bishops' condemnation of Trump's immigration policies that allow raids in churches and schools. A convert to Catholicism, Vance says he was drawn to this denomination in large part because it's so old, and also because of the writings of St. Augustine, whom he admired for his logical clarity. I kind of cringed when I learned this, when, as part of my theological education, I was reading Augustine's Confessions, written around the year 400 of the Common Era. I was struck less by Augustine's intellectual deftness than by his attitude toward the women in his pre-celibate life. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate them or even love them, but they were bit players in the bigger drama of his life. sent to him to guide or test him on the road to conversion and church leadership. Christian theologian philosophers from the 4th century Augustine through the 13th century Aquinas set standards and tone for Christian theology, even as they struggled with the nature of women. Yeah, they were all men. A big issue for them was the body-mind dichotomy. Augustine identified males with the mind and spirit and females with the body, which needed to be overcome and kind of, put under control. Aquinas famously declared that women were misbegotten males. Christian asceticism, building on a primitive fear of blood and bodily processes, identified women solely with the flesh and all its corruptions. There was debate about whether women were truly human. All of this despite the recorded example of Jesus, who appeared in all the stories that we have about him to have accepted women as individuals, as persons of worth. These are the strands, however, of Christian teaching that undergird Christian nationalism. How to resolve the philosopher-theologian's male dilemma regarding women as sources of temptation for men seeking the path to God. Yeah, it was all heteronormative back then. Looking at that versus the human race's need for women in reproduction, it's kind of a balance there. And the resolution came to, in many ways, just seize upon the one area that belonged solely to women, childbearing, and cast that function as women's sole and definitive reason for being. In her book, Policing the Womb, Michelle Goodwin writes, "The battle over women's autonomy, especially their reproductive health care and decision-making, has always been about much more than simply women's health and safety. Rather, male power, control, and domination over women's reproduction historically served political purposes and entrenched social and cultural norms that framed women's capacities almost exclusively as service to a husband, mothering, reproducing, and sexual chattel." All of the laws recently passed by states restricting and criminalizing access to abortion, all the considerations of possible legal curtailing of birth control, the fetal personhood proposals to state constitutions are all rooted in this view of women, coupled with lack of compassion or empathy for the person who is pregnant or physically capable of becoming pregnant, now backed with political clout. They become the laws of the land. Vice President Vance delighted in his friendship and camaraderie with Charlie Kirk. He says, "We used to argue about Catholicism and Protestantism and who was right about minor doctrinal questions. But it was clear, as with the priest I met at the rally last week, Vance knew that he and Kirk were of the same basic orientation to their faith." Just after the 2016 presidential election, I had a dream, and I wrote this poem. Awakening, November 9th, 2016. On the morning after the elections, luminous lines of scripture danced and coursed through my dream-fogged brain. Love is patient, love is kind, and envies no one. Love is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in what is right. And then I heard a voice, harsh and whiny with vituperation, scathing and dismissive in its brassy utterance. Loser! Oh my God, I gasped in sudden consciousness. We just elected the Antichrist. Writing in 2020, Kristen Kobus-Dumez asked, how could family values conservatives support a man who flouted every value they insisted they held dear? How could the self-described moral majority embrace a candidate who reveled in vulgarity? How could evangelicals who'd turned "what would Jesus do" into a national phenomenon justify their support for a man who seemed the very antithesis of the savior they claimed to emulate? Pundits scrambled to explain. They were holding their noses, choosing the lesser of two evils. Hillary Clinton, whose birthday is today, was one of those reasons, was that evil. They were thinking in purely transactional terms, voting for Trump because he had promised to deliver Supreme Court appointments that would protect the unborn and secure their own religious liberty. But, she continues, their support for Trump was no aberration, nor was it merely a pragmatic choice. It was rather the culmination of their embrace of militant masculinity, an ideology that enshrines patriarchal authority and condones the callous display of power at home and abroad. By the time Trump arrived, proclaiming himself that savior, this brand of conservative white evangelicals had already traded a faith that values humility and elevates the least of these for one that derides gentleness as the province of wusses. Having replaced the Jesus of the Gospels with a vengeful warrior Christ, it is no wonder many came to think of Trump in that same way. In 2016, many observers were stunned at the white evangelicals' apparent betrayal of their own values. In reality, those evangelicals did not cast the vote despite their beliefs, but because of them. How do those of us who are Christians but not Christian nationalists relate to this president, of whom it is said he has no moral core, whose only principle is tariffs, whose motivation is greed for power and wealth, who has told his supporters repeatedly, "I am your retribution"? Bishop William Barber of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, leader of the Moral Mondays and Witnesses, he drafted a pastoral letter to the president dated August 28th. My signature, along with hundreds of others, maybe some here, is on it. It begins, "Dear Donald, we are pastors, addressing you here not by your title in the office of President of the United States, but by the name you bear as a sacred child of God. We saw in the news last week that you said you want to try to get to heaven if possible, but that you are hearing you are really at the bottom of the totem pole. We've been pastors long enough to know that fear isn't a sustaining motivation for spiritual growth, but it does get some people started, especially older people who've carefully avoided addressing their own mortality. We all die. And before we meet our Maker, we each have the opportunity to receive the free gift of grace that makes all things new. We want you to know that gift today, both for your sake and the sake of the whole world that is subject to the consequences of your actions. We are aware that some people do not pray for anything but the wrath of God to come down upon you. It is not a charitable prayer, but it is understandable. You have targeted people with words and policies that have made their lives a living hell. Though we are not among those you demonize, or though we are among those you demonize because we disagree with you, we do not join those who pray for your demise. We cannot. We serve a God who calls us to pray for our enemies, and we have taken vows that compel us to offer pastoral care to all people, especially those who are captive to the powers of sin, death, and the devil. When we say our prayers each morning, we ask God to set you free. I will attempt to live up to that standard of commitment, even while, as the text of the letter continues to do, even while calling out the lies upon which Trump's Christian nationalist position is based, and calling him to repentance. All of us who are Christian, of any persuasion, need to do this, need to attest to what Christianity is all about from our perspective, that it is not just one point of view, that there is room for all of our beliefs, that indeed all of our beliefs are welcome. All of us, whether of a religious persuasion or not, must persevere as defenders of the Constitution, the separation of church and state, the reality that no one must face a test of religious belief in this country. And I hope that we will all take heart from the vision expressed by the poet Amanda Gorman. Thus may our crisis be our cry, our crossroad, the oldest ode we owe each other. We chime it for the climate, for our communities. We shall respect and protect every part of this planet, hand it to every heart on this earth, until no one's worth is rendered by the grace, gender, class, or identity they were born. This morn, let it be sworn that we are one human kin, grounded not just by the griefs we bear, but by the good we begin. A myth worth living into. Thank you.